What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well. Welcome to a new episode of Everything You Need to Know About. Today's topic is going to be carbohydrates. Now, before we start, I want to say that with this series, the way I'm going to approach it from now on is that I'm going to give you, for now, the bare basics of what you need to know. And slowly but surely, I'm going to increase the complexity of the topics. For now, we're going to focus on the topic of today, which is carbohydrates. And I mean, who doesn't like their carbs, right?
Tom, you need carbs. Your brain runs on glucose. For simple cognitive functions, you need them.
Not only in terms of flavor, but also in terms of the benefits it gives us as bodybuilders, right? As people that work out and are jacked, right? Look at this bicep vein. So we like carbohydrates in all aspects, but before talking about the benefits of carbohydrates, we have to know what they are. So let's get into the first slide. We're going to first talk about the carbohydrates in terms of their chemical formula. So carbohydrates have two parts of the word, carb and hydrates. So can you guess what they're made of?
Can you take a guess?
Carbon and water. I know, super original, super mind-blowing, but yeah, it's a certain amount of carbon and the same amount of water. The only one that doesn't follow this formula is rhamnose. In general, all of these sugars, carbohydrates, however you want to call them, they follow that same formula of carbon and water. So with that in mind, I'm going to briefly move on into a little segue, which is talking about carbohydrates in their basic. This is what is called a linear form of carbohydrates. And as you can see, it's just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, nothing too scary. So we have this form right here, and we have a lot of carbons attached to OHs, right? And this one is bound to two hydrogens, which is the same one over here. So glucose is not, this is glucose, by the way.
Glucose!
If you don't know how to read, which if you're in this channel, you probably don't.
I'm retarded?
With glucose,
Glucose!
what we're going to find out is that it's not found in this linear fashion. What we're going to find it in is one of these configurations, which is its cyclical form. The process that happens to go from this to this is called the cyclicization of glucose.
Glucose!
I hope I said that correctly. To summarize basically what it is that here, OH's group, if you know your organic chemistry,
Yes, science!
they are very electronegative or nucleophiles compounds. So they're going to look for positively charged molecules. And here we have a carbon that is attached with a sigma and pi bond to the oxygen right here. So there's going to, the electrons of the carbon are going to be way shifted over to the oxygen. So what is going to happen is that the OH is going to attack this very electropositive carbon because this one is very electronegative. So it's going to cause the structure to fold. Now, is it going to fold in 2D like this? No, it's actually going to fold in 3D. So it's actually going to attack it either from the front or from the back.
Front and back!
And depending on how it attacks, it's going to end up either in alpha glucose or beta glucose.
Glucose!
I'm going to get to that in a second. So this OH is going to go towards this carbon and it's going to lose the hydrogen. It's going to lose the hydrogen so it can bond to the carbon right here. And the hydrogen that is released is going to join to this oxygen right here. So it's like they exchange to form this bond right here. Now, depending if it attaches or binds itself from the front or the back, you're going to get this OH either at the bottom or in its alpha position, or you're going to get it pointed up, which is in its beta position. So another thing to consider is not only the OH pointing up or down, is also the fact that this molecule right here could be mirrored, which are called stereoisomers in organic chemistry. And what we find is that you can basically classify glucose as either alpha or beta or anomeres, those are called, and you can also classify it by which stereoisomer it is. So it's either L-glucose or D-glucose.
Glucose!
This one right here is D-glucose, if I'm not mistaken, and the L-glucose is the same, but
mirror. So
this is right here, and the rest ones are pointing the other way. That's basically it. So now we can go back to this first slide. Sorry, there we go. Here we have the structure, which is the glucose, and here we have glucose.
Glucose!
Another classification we can give to carbohydrates, and that is, I'm going to go back to the to this slide right here, which is the group that it has. So here we have an aldehyde group. We can also have a ketone group, if I'm not mistaken. Either have an aldehyde here, or we can have a keto group right here, which basically turns it into an aldose or a ketose. Fructose is actually a ketose, and not only that, depending on the amount of carbon that it has, you can also classify it. If it has, for example, in this case, 6, it's an hexose, so with the prefix hex. If it's 5 carbons, we have a pentose. But it's just another way of chemically classifying carbohydrates, and this is going to dictate a lot of the characteristics of not only the molecule itself, but also how it works within a larger structure. So going back to this, depending on how many molecules it has, we can classify them. So basic glucose or basic fructose, we have monosaccharides. Fairly simple, straight to the point. Mono, one, saccharides, sugar. Then we have here what is sucrose or table sugar, as you probably know it. This one is a disaccharide too. And then we have what are called polysaccharides, which is either the same structure, like the same molecule repeated over and over, in which case it is a homopolysaccharide, or they are different molecules that repeat over and over. And in the case that they are different, is a heteropolysaccharide. An example, and this is very important because I want you to look very closely at these molecules right here. So what we can find is that starch is joined on the alpha glucose. So remember, if it's pointing downwards, it's alpha. If it's pointing upwards, it's beta. So they join right here via what is called an alpha 1,4 bond. And this is the thing that has calories for us. But here we have cellulose. Do you see anything different between the two? Because they're basically the same molecule, but there's something different here. Here we have beta glucose and not alpha glucose. And contrary to starch, we can't really digest this one. We can extract calories from this one. Cows can because they have the enzymes, but we don't. See how a little difference in chemical structure can change its whole property? I think it's pretty amazing.
It's actually, I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
So here are the, again, starch, cellulose, and this is the glycogen that all of the bodybuilders talk about, and all the people's like, oh, you have to have glycogen in your muscles to get swole, you know? This is right here. It's a polymer that is branched, and actually starch is not conformed by just a straight line. That's amylose. In actuality, starch is composed by amylopectin, which is kind of like this. It's branched in a similar fashion, and amylose, which is a straight chain of glucoses. This one is way more branched. Starch is presented in what are called granules, starch granules. Then we have what is glucose metabolism. So this is fairly simple if you have done your biochemistry, in high school.
It never happened. It's false.
So you have glucose, by enzymes, it gets decomposed into pyruvate or pyruvic acid also. And in humans, at least, we can go two separate ways. You can either go to oxidative phosphorylation or the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, as is well known. And here you have the pyruvate, which turns into this compound right here and then starts the cycle. And what is produced here is carbon dioxide and coenzymes, which is NADH and FADH. And then those compounds go to the mitochondria, which, it's a powerhouse of the cell. And there it produces ATP via electron transport. So this is very important for energy because ATP, as you can see right here, is actually the coin by which you pay with energy in your body. It's kind of like that. It's like a currency of energy. So if you restrict oxygen, or for example, if you watch the high reps video, you would know that once you start adopting an anaerobic pathway to get energy, you get lactic acid or lactate. Now we move on to another thing that I wanted to mention, that is the pentose phosphate pathway. This is very important to produce basically compounds that are going to be of crucial relevance in your metabolic functions, but you don't have to dig very into that. The main one was the one that we talked about before. Then we have an anabolic pathway of glucose. This one we store glycogen, have the glucose, which gets turned into glucose 6-phosphate, and then it turns into glucose 1-phosphate, then in uracil D-phosphate glucose, if I'm not mistaken.
You're goddamn right.
And then it turns into glycogen. And then that glycogen gets stored in your muscles and your liver for future use as an energy reserve. We need to intake carbs for energy, and when we store it for later metabolic use. So it's important you get carbohydrates on your diet.
And now here's a word from our sponsor.
Before you keep watching, make sure to check my coffee page right here or in the description. If you help me and our community to reach the goal, I'll release 5 programs to the public. And if you donate at least $5, you get an extra, fully customized version of one of the programs in the pack. Thanks for listening, and let's keep going with the video. The nutritional roles of carbs, as I just said,
That's what he said.
is that they are the main fuel source for our body. During digestion, the sugars that we have in our food get basically broken down. And in fact, in your mouth, you have already enzymes that start degrading the food that you're intaking. So right from the point where you put it in your mouth, you start degrading it. Get into the intestine, and they get absorbed as simple sugars. And then they get into the bloodstream, and there you have the blood sugar stuff. It enters into the cell thanks to insulin. It's like the key that, opens the cell to insulin, hey, come in. And that's how you get glucose in your cells. And the rest gets stored as glycogen, as we previously talked about. Now we have the glycemic index, and that is basically how much they're going to raise your blood sugar levels. In general, those are the values. I think that it is very intuitive. The more processed something is, or the less fiber it has, and the faster it digests, the higher the glycemic index. In general, in terms of general health, the higher, the worse. Because you're going to get those sugar crashes. You feel all you feel all energetic, and you feel like running around and, kicking an old lady and then stealing a car.
What the hell did you just say?
But then you feel like taking a nap, and you're like, oh man, and then you go into a coma for like 6 weeks. In general, you want to avoid high glycemic index foods if you are not doing physical activity. And if you are, you don't want to be constantly eating high glycemic index foods. You actually want to keep it low.
Keep it down.
As much as possible, and then we can strategize about using them, because there's actually a use for high glycemic index food when it comes to bodybuilding, which I'm going to get into in a second. In terms of sources, we have the fast-absorbing sugars, which are the bad ones, which we have white flour, sugar, honey. And by the way, by those idiots that believe that honey is somehow better, even like raw honey, it's all the same. It's fructose and glucose. Then we have fruit juices, which again, sugar water. It's not magical. It's not filled with vitamins and nutrients. Sugar water.
Give me sugar and water.
High fructose corn syrup, glucose syrup. They're basically all the same.
They're all the same.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Highly processed, readily available sugars that your body quickly processes, and you get a crash. Then we have whole fruits, which have fiber, have actual minerals and stuff, which is going to make the digestion slower. The same goes with vegetables, whole grains. Whole grains have mainly carbohydrates and some fiber, like a tiny amount, but they also have some protein alongside it, but they are mainly healthy sources of carbs. Then you have legumes, which I mentioned in the protein video, the fact that they have carbs and they have protein. So they're a healthy way to intake carbs, but also intake proteins. And because they have proteins and fiber, it's going to make the absorption and the digestion slower, and therefore you're not going to get that sugar crash when you eat them. Then you have dairy products, because dairy has lactose. And then we have liver. So liver, I think you have heard plenty of liver thanks to a certain YouTuber, but liver actually has carbs because that's where you store the glycogen. So those are the sources. As you can see here, we have a very descriptive image of what I'm talking about. And here we have pasta, which it depends, because we have whole grains, which if you're eating whole grain pasta, it's going to count into that. But Otherwise, it counts as flour because it doesn't have any fiber at all, and you get those sugar crashes. So in general, eat whole grain pasta or eat pasta with something else, like add oil, add protein source, legumes. The thing is, with the glycemic index, and this is a critic or something that I have to point out, you can't really rely on it too much because, I mean, who the fuck is eating just straight up honey from the jar? Most people are not going to open up a packet of flour and start like chewing down, you know, or like bland pasta without anything else, like just salt. Who the fuck does that? Like the whitest of whitest men on the planet.
8 o'clock in the morning, I'll have fish and a rice cake. At 10 o'clock, I'll have fish. At 12 o'clock, I'll have fish and a rice cake. At 2 o'clock, I'll have fish.
It doesn't make sense because you have to look at the food in its context, right? So you have your pasta and you add some vegetables, then the glycemic index is not going to be as high. You have to take into account how digestion works instead of like following strictly the glycemic index. So if you're going to eat something that is very high in the glycemic index, don't panic, okay? And try to mix it up with something that is lower absorption, right? So also, if your goal is actually to intake something that is fast absorbing, do the opposite. Avoid intaking one of those, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So here are the general recommendations, the conventional advice, which is basically the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that carbohydrates make up 45 to 65% of total daily calories. You should generally get them from low glycemic index food. Now here's my advice. If you're in a bulk, make sure to get your protein, 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 and then you get your fats, which on a bulk, because your calories are going to be higher, you can get away with like 25% of your calories being fat, and in fact, it might actually be good because fat turns into fat fairly easy because it's very similar to the thing that it's turning into. So if you're intaking a lot of fat on a bulk, it's probably going to affect you more negatively than intaking carbohydrates. So lower down on the fat in terms of percentages, not in terms of the grams you need of fat to function hormonally properly. And then the rest is carbs. So protein, you get your goal, then you say, okay, these are my calories and this should be fat. Okay, you subtract everything and the rest is carbs. That's it, not that complicated. If you're in a cut, because your calories are lower and you still have to get the same amount of fats to work properly hormonally, it's going to be a higher percentage. So you're going to have to, by default, cut down on carbs. What I'm also going to recommend is the 80-20 approach. 80% should be healthy carbs in most meals, like legumes, whole grains, stuff like that. For example, in this case, legumes, because they're a great source of carbs and protein. But then, when you need, for example, maybe your fasted. For example, you do intermittent fasting. Another example, you intake a meal, you go to work, you get out of work, you haven't eaten anything, right? You had your protein, right? You had an adequate amount of protein, but you go to the gym and let's just say that you need like that little boost in energy. You can use fast absorbing carbs intra or post workout or even pre-workout if you're going to your job, for example, after your job, to refill your stores after training and to have enough energy and to have the effect of being carb loaded without having to eat a lot of carbs because they're going to be fast absorbing. It makes sense also into workout. I think that we have all experimented, especially if you are fasted, that during the middle of the workout and you're like, fuck man, I just want to leave. But then you intake something with sugar and you're like, holy fuck. And then you start like throwing energy waves at people and stuff like that. That's in terms of the recommendations. So this is the conclusion for today's video. And the thing pending is going to be fiber. The reason why I didn't want to include fiber in this video, even though it's a carbohydrate, is because we can get into a lot more with fiber than we can with carbs for now, just because we have different types of fiber. We have the soluble, insoluble, we have hemicellulose, we have beta-glucans, and we have a lot of stuff to talk about. So carbs are going to have pseudo two parts. Is not carbohydrates in itself, but it's like fiber. You get what I mean, right? In terms of nutrition. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like down below. Give me your feedback. As always, I'm listening. And make sure to drop a like. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.
Protein, protein. Do you like protein? In the soy, in the meat, Everybody likes protein.